Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in this world. It's your host, Dhaiphong, and as you can see, I am joined by returning guests, Alex Christopher and Alexander Mercuris of the Duran. Good evening, guys. How are you doing? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Danny. Very happy to be here again in 2024.
Yes, yes. Happy New Year. Great. We have a lot to get to. We can get started, but before we do, everyone, make sure you hit that like button. That helps ensure this stream is boosted in the YouTube algorithm. Of course, please do follow the work of the Duran. You can find them at the Duran on YouTube, Rumble, Rockfin, all of the platforms. And of course, you can go to the video description here and support this channel in all the various ways: Patreon, Substack, YouTube, and more. So yeah, let's get right to this. Let's begin with Ukraine. So the end of 2023 saw the launch from Russian campaign across Ukraine. There were about 500 in a matter of less than a week, I believe it was, according to the BBC. And the Western mainstream media has also been reporting the aftermath, the attacks on Belgorod from Ukraine, the Russian city of Belgorod, as a retaliatory strike. There have been numerous of these strikes. The first one killed about 25 Russian people. Then the subsequent strikes were reported as foiled by the Russian side. I wanted to ask you both, what are the meanings of these strikes? Maybe we can begin on the Russian side. Alexander, how significant is this, and what does it tell us about the conflict and where it is right now?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that the Ukrainians may be representing their attacks on Belgorod as retaliatory strikes. But if one is simply talking about scale, and I'm not, that's all I'm talking about now. I'm not talking about the morals of this. The attack on Belgorod, it might be completely different. But simply in terms of scale, the Russian strikes are overwhelmingly greater and more powerful and far more devastating. And in fact, a few hours ago, when I was, researching the program that I did today, we've been getting more and more information coming out of Kiev, which was the major focus of the last big Russian missile strike, and it's pointing to an absolutely devastating picture. I mean, there are now satellite photos of factories, being reduced to smoking ruins, stories about production line workers, armaments workers being killed in large numbers, reports of air defense systems being destroyed, bunkers being destroyed. We can't verify and corroborate all of these claims, but the information that we do have points to an absolutely overwhelming strike carried out by many different kinds of missiles, launched from many different types of many different directions, over 4 waves of strikes, involving drones, missiles, a much more sophisticated attack in some respects than the attacks that we saw last year, which the Russians were engaging in last year, and doing huge damage. Now, huge damage to Ukraine's military-industrial complex, and a Ukrainian official has now come forward and has basically admitted that building weapons in Ukraine is impossible because the Russians are able to launch these strikes. But also massive damage to this air defense system that the West has worked so hard over the last year to try and build up in Ukraine. in the aftermath of the actually smaller Russian missile strikes that we saw last year. And the impression I'm getting is that this Western air defense system is being overwhelmed by the Russian strikes, which are larger, more sophisticated, more complex, and that the Western air defense system is proving more fragile than expected. And we're beginning to see signs of alarm and panic. There's a report earlier today that the European Union is going to try and find 1,000 Patriot missile interceptors, which might struggle to do. It's intended apparently to rebuild its own air defense system. Ukraine now accounts for a quarter of the Western air defense systems across the entirety of Europe. So that gives you an idea of how big this investment in this air defense system has been. And there's talk about setting up production lines for Patriot missiles in Europe, which is what the Europeans always say they're going to do. And I don't think anybody really takes that especially seriously. But the fact that they're talking in this kind of way shows how alarmed they are becoming by the sheer scale of this Russian missile strike. And of course, all the indications is that there are going to be more strikes like this coming over the next few weeks and months. And of course, the Russians have not yet used their most sophisticated and advanced cruise missile of all, which is their new Zircon missile, which we know entered series production last year. We don't know how many of them have been produced so far, but it's a hypersonic missile. But unlike the Kinzhal, which is an air-launched ballistic missile, this is a cruise missile that can therefore attack from multiple directions. Its movements can't be tracked in a way that, say, the Kinzhal missile can be. The Russians haven't used it, and one wonders what will happen if they ever do.
Any follow-up, Alex?
No, I think Alexander pretty much covered it. Putin said a while back, we haven't even started yet. I remember him saying that. We haven't even started yet. And I mean, it's just, the whole, I read the story buying 1,000 Patriot missiles, and they're just prolonging the agony of Ukraine. It really is. It's a terrible thing, actually.
And offering false hope. I mean, because that's what it amounts to.
Yeah, exactly. It's false hope. They're prolonging the agony because these politicians simply just can't admit that they've lost. Surrender, capitulate. Tell Zelensky to call up someone who can then call up Putin. They can save, possibly, I don't even know if that's possible anymore, possibly save whatever Ukraine or their state will be, depending on the Russians' terms, which are going to be very hard. But at least you save hundreds of thousands of lives, and I believe you save Ukraine in whatever form that's going to be. But they can't do it. The Europeans can't do it. The Americans can't do it. And just going off on what Alexander said, you can see. I don't know, Alexander, if you've read these reports, but I'm getting the sense that there are European leaders that are trying to distance themselves from Ukraine. You have Macron coming out and giving a statement. Well, we're not going to send weapons directly to Ukraine, and we're gonna invest in building a military-industrial complex there. Norway is saying the same thing. You can see that they're trying to figure out a way to show that they're still supporting the project, but they're keeping some distance. And Russia's coming along and saying, this is nonsense. You're going to build military factories. Come on, guys. I mean, we've been saying it for a while now, this building factories, and Ukraine's going to be what did they say? The Silicon Valley of military production in Europe. I mean, this is nonsense. This is nonsense. And then the Russians are proving it.
Well, I wanted to actually, I know you both are studious readers of Western mainstream media, and on this point of Ukraine catching up to the United States and the West in terms of weapons production, or maybe taking the responsibility of weapons production from the U.S. and West as they struggle to produce their own ammunition and artillery, etc. There is this article by Jack Watling. You may be familiar with him, Alexander. He is UK based, I believe. I think he was in the defense sector, and he has this to say in Foreign Affairs about a realistic plan for Ukraine. He says it would involve resourcing Kiev to maintain a defensive posture through most of 2024, while units are trained and equipped to mount offensive operations in 2025. Beyond the certainty this plan would offer Ukraine's generals, it would also signal to the Kremlin that it cannot count on winning a years-long war of attrition against an increasingly thinly resourced Ukraine. A U.S. commitment to supporting Ukraine through 2024 would also shift European allies' incentives toward investing more deeply in increasing the capacity of their weapons industries, reducing the burden on the U.S. through 2025. So this is exactly what you both are saying. I mean, that's first of all, this article claims that this isn't a stalemate, but the conclusion was that Russia and Ukraine lost. So of course they didn't see that Ukraine and primarily was the loser of 2023. But here, it's exactly what you both are saying, that this is what they're hoping for. They're hoping for almost outsourcing this conflict to Ukraine while it is being bombarded with just the lightest of what Russia can offer, or at least a very light version of what Russia can offer in terms of its capabilities.
Absolutely. I mean, I find this kind of article actually distressing. And Jack Watling is a member of the Royal United Services Institute. He's actually sometimes written some quite interesting and intelligent pieces about this war. He's somebody who should know better, because what he is proposing is fantasy. It is complete fantasy. Now, there is a case. It was expressed, it was articulated way back last August by Jim Webb and George Beebe. Also, by the way, I think it was in Time magazine, actually, but they suggested that Ukraine go over to the defensive, abandon its counteroffensive, which was at that point already looking like it was going to fail, and open negotiations with the Russians. Now, what they're now saying is Ukraine go over to the defensive and keep fighting indefinitely, forever. Go on taking this constant hammering from the Russians day after day, week after week, see more of its industries destroyed, see more of its people killed, see more of its army degraded, because, of course, we can't accept the idea that the Russians are likely to win this war. And that's, when I say we, I don't mean the Ukrainians. I mean, exactly as Alex said, certain political figures in the West. Now, understand one thing about Jack Watling. He is, of course, British. And he is essentially here following the line of the British government. Now, there was an article that appeared just on Sunday in the Times, the London Times, which is, of course, the newspaper, practically to all intents and purposes, the newspaper of record here. And it said that the British government is now fanning out across Europe. It's sending its people all over Europe, saying to them, keep on funding Ukraine, go on producing weapons for Ukraine, keep this war going as long as you can, even if Donald Trump, horror of horrors, wins the election in the United States and cuts off American aid to Ukraine. We can't stop now. We can't let Putin win. If we focus all our energies on building up our military industrial complex in Europe, then we can somehow exhaust and outplay the Russians. That's exactly what Jack Watling is basically saying. So you can see various people in the British establishment are talking about these things. Now, it is completely unrealistic. It isn't going to happen. To see how unrealistic it is, go back to that title and look at the subtitle. He points about how Ukraine's counteroffensive failed. They always say this. They always say it failed. It didn't fail. It was defeated. The Russians defeated Ukraine's counteroffensive. The Russians won the battle. But they can't accept that. It all has to be expressed in terms of success or failure, not as you should do in war, defeat or victory. Now, the West has given huge resources to Ukraine. It's given its tanks, armored vehicles, self-propelled guns, millions of artillery shells, and they were defeated last summer. What realistic chance is there that if we start going around investing in factories which won't be producing anything for 5 years, that this is going to change?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible that these are grown-ups. These are adults that are coming up with these ideas and these plans. It just shows that they really don't care one bit about Ukraine. This is all ego. This is all ego. It's all about their power. It's all about their position. We can't be seen losing to the Russians. We can't be seen, we can't be seen losing to Putin. God forbid it looks like we've lost to Putin. Because Putin, he's the devil. He's everything that's wrong with the world. It's all been projected onto Putin. And so they can't be seen as losing to Putin. So, we're just going to run around and we don't have any more weapons because we've been demilitarized, right? The UK has nothing left. So they've been demilitarized by this war, and now they're going to run around and talk to other countries and try to convince other countries to demilitarize themselves so that they can accomplish what 3, 4, 500 billion and all the weapons of the UK and the US and France and Germany couldn't accomplish in the counteroffensive. So if you're a world leader and you buy into this sales pitch, I don't know what to say. Prepare to be demilitarized, I guess. But I mean, this is nonsense. This is not how you win a war. But they can't admit that they lost. And Alexander's right. And I even say it. I say the failed counteroffensive. That's how good their propaganda is. That's how good their propaganda is. I say failed counteroffensive. But it's true. They were defeated. And they've been getting defeated for the last 2 years. So, enough's enough. That's what they should be saying. Enough's enough. We've got a lot of elections in 2024, elections all over the place. Let's end this thing and let's just admit that we lost, and let's just forget about this regime change, balkanization of Russia obsession that we've had over the last 50 years. And that would be the healthy, right thing for them to do, but they won't do it. We know that.
Yeah. And not only will they not do it, but they keep repeating. Back to this. I thought this article was a kind of a great indicator and illustration of this desperation and this delusional thinking. Here, even Watling admits that at one point, Ukraine was closer to where Russia was firing in terms of the amount of artillery rounds. But by the end of 2023, Ukraine was only firing 2,000 rounds per day, and Russia is now firing 10,000. That's a huge ratio. That's 5-1 Russian advantage. So they keep talking about arming Ukraine, get them to a point where there's parity. But first of all, that I don't think that would achieve victory, and it doesn't even seem like that's at all possible anytime in the future, given that Russia is not viewing this as a stalemate at all, right?
No, they're not. The Russians are not viewing this as any kind of stalemate. As Alex absolutely correctly said, Putin some time ago said we haven't even started yet. And in fact, what we're seeing, even as we speak now, is not a stalemate. it's a situation where the advantage is tilting steadily towards the Russians, but where they are still engaged in an attrition war. They still haven't really started yet. If you're tracking developments within Russia itself, what you're steadily seeing is a Russian military that is building up steadily, incrementally, and relatively fast. They've called up around 480,000 troops this year. 480,000 men have joined the Russian army, not this year, in 2023, joined the Russian army. All the indications are that military equipment production is increasing at rates that no one in the West so far has come remotely close to matching. I mean, we're talking about artillery. I mean, he talks about, that the Ukrainians are firing around 2,000 shells a day. That might even be an overestimate, by the way. The Russians are firing around 10,000 shells a day, a 5-to-1 ratio. But again, all the information that is coming out from Russia and elsewhere suggests that Russian artillery production is growing. And the latest information, and this isn't fully confirmed because obviously a lot of this is kept secret, but I'm getting this again from a multiplicity of sources, including some from within Russia itself, is that Russian artillery production, weapons production, increased fivefold between the start of the military operation and the fall of 2023. And now it has surged again. And it's now, the Russian Defense Ministry says, 17 and a half times greater than it was at the time when the war started. And I have asked, what does this mean in terms of actual output of shells? And I'm told that currently it's between 4 and 5 million shells a year. 4 and 5 million. That's around 500,000 shells. Apparently it's around something like 500,000 shells a month. Now, compare that with 2,000 shells, which Ukraine is firing a day. I mean, which comes to what, 60,000? I mean, you're starting to see how the numbers are starting to go. It's very soon going to be a 10-to-1 ratio. And even that's probably not the limit of this.
What was the EU goal that they set out? A million shells, isn't that what they set out to
shells.
do?
Yeah, and they only they've only provided a third of those, and they had to make up the difference by borrowing shells from South Korea, and they didn't make up the difference even there. But they borrowed 500,000 shells from South Korea, and they've been largely used up. It's likely that Ukraine's ability to keep firing shells is actually going to fall. It may be, if it's still 2,000 rounds a day, it's probably not going to remain at that level for much longer.
Yeah, and the EU created all types of incentives. They created a fund. They told member states that they'll actually buy the shells that they have in their inventory. They'll buy the shells from the member states. They told the member states that they'll invest in their production of shells. I mean, they incentivized this thing to the hilt. And the bottom line is that the member states in the EU, they couldn't do it because they just don't have the production. They can't do it. I can tell you, in Greece, you can't do these things. The days where we had factories and we could produce stuff like it's gone. It's over. It's not coming back. We lost that many, many years ago when we joined the EU. That all went to Germany. That was the deal, right? That was the deal. You enter the European Union, all the production, all the manufacturing gets centralized to Germany, and you guys, you do your tourism, you do your services industries, and we'll leave it there. So I mean, this is all fantasy. This production of a million shells that the EU wants to do, or a million drones, or whatever, 1,000 Patriot missiles. This is fiction. This is fantasy.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. And perhaps we can place the the context or place these attacks, the missile strikes by Russia, and of course the Belgorod atrocities committed by Ukraine in the context of the last year, and maybe we can do some myth and reality kind of discussion analysis, because in the midst of the intensifying Russian missile campaign and then the atrocities in Belgorod, you have, especially in the collective West, of course, the mainstream media, talking about civilian atrocities, attacks on civilian infrastructure. So the Ukraine side and all of their backers claim that Russia deliberately attacks civilians. They did so in their latest missile strike campaign. And then you have Vladimir Putin, who categorically rejects this, has discussed quite clearly how Ukraine deliberately, I mean, this was a market that Ukraine hit in Belgorod, killing 25. And what Putin said, though, initially after what happened at Belgorod, he said, "We are striking with high precision weapons at decision-making centers, locations where military personnel and mercenaries gather, at other nodes of this kind, at military facilities first of all. They are quite painful, these strikes, but that's what we will continue to do," indicating that Russia is very careful, but at the same time, very committed to hitting military installations. So which side then? What's the myth and what's the reality on each side? Because I think it's important to outline this, and maybe you can place it in the context of what happened in 2023.
Well, I mean, I think the first place to go in any discussion of this is the casualty figures, the civilian casualty figures. And these have been provided to a great extent by Ukraine, and they've been supported also to a great extent by the United Nations agencies. And they talk about something like 18,000 Ukrainian civilians. Not all of them, by the way, are on Ukrainian territory. I mean, there's been civilians on the other side as well. Anyway, they've died over the course of this war. Now, that appears to be around the same number of civilians that have died in the fighting in Gaza. I mean, this is just, it's a comparison. It's, you look at the UN figures, that gives you this. Now, the Gaza fighting has been ongoing for about 2 months. This war in Ukraine over a far bigger territory involving a much larger use of weapons has been ongoing now for almost 2 years. Now, the only explanation for this huge discrepancy in numbers is that the Russians clearly are not aiming to kill as many civilians as possible. They're clearly trying to avoid civilian deaths. That is what the numbers tell us. And let me stress again, they're not my numbers. They're not the Russians' numbers. We're talking about Ukrainian numbers and UN figures. So the Russians clearly are not aiming to target civilians. I mean, that has to be correct. And if you follow and track Russian missile and bomb strikes with the level of attention that I and Alex, unfortunately, are obliged to do because that's the work we do. Well, you can see this. You can see that every single missile and bomb strike and that the Russians launch clearly has a military objective and one that you can understand. I mean, they're attacking armaments facilities, they're attacking warehouses, they're attacking air defense systems. Everything has a military objective that you can relate to the rest of the war. Now, if we are talking about the attack on Belgorod, or indeed the shelling of Donetsk, which happens regularly, by the way, one cannot say that. One cannot specifically come forward and say, what is this target that the Ukrainians are attacking? And what is the objective of this attack in military terms? It is not possible to give an explanation. And that, I'm afraid, does bring us back to what Putin was saying, that these do look like not just reprisal attacks, but attacks that are intended to target civilian facilities and to cause panic and fear in the civilian population. And of course, launching attacks of that nature. I'm not an expert on war crimes law, but I understand it is a war crime.
Now, let me just read you what ABC News put out yesterday with regards to the strikes in Belgorod. This is the title of their article. Ukraine trains its sights on Russian border region, seeking to stir up discontent. Seeking to stir up discontent. And then further down in the article, ABC News, not me, this is ABC News, says hitting Belgorod and disrupting city life is a dramatic way for Ukraine to show it can strike against Russia, whose military outnumbers and outguns Kiev's forces. The tactic appeared to be having some success, with signs the attacks are unsettling the public, political leaders, and military observers. To stir up discontent. That's what these strikes are about. You kind of come back full circle to why this conflict even started, which is to try and stir up discontent so that you can remove Putin. This was always about Russia, right? And here we are again 2 years later. And what's the purpose of these attacks? To stir up discontent in the Kremlin. Palace intrigue. Someone's going to get upset with Putin and say, why are you allowing this? And you're going too soft on them, and whatever. They want to create these fights that they believe they're going to create in the Kremlin, and then they're hoping that somewhere down the line someone's going to say, I've had enough with the Russian government. They're waging this war all wrong. They haven't even called it a war. They still call it a special military operation. That should tell you a lot right there. So yeah, that's ABC News.
Yeah. And now with this, the past year was characterized, 2023, by the counteroffensive and the defeat of Ukraine in that counteroffensive. How did we get to this point where there's a disaster? It seems like there's a disaster unfolding. The collective West seems to be, despite all of its attempts, like Mr. Watling, as seen in Foreign Affairs, all of these attempts in the Western mainstream media to confuse the picture, there seems to be a growing admission that Russian victory is inevitable. But this was not how the United States, the collective West as a whole, was talking just 1 year ago. So how did this happen? And was this foreseen? Is this something that the collective West kind of knew was going to happen, or did it just go into this truly believing that Ukraine could somehow go full steam ahead toward some kind of victory? Because that seems to be another part of this myth versus reality with this conflict, is the cacophony around it from the collective West is so loud that it's hard to believe that they don't believe their own their own errors, and they don't believe their own stories and make believe when it comes to Ukraine.
The key to answering your question is to go back to the point that Alex just made, which is that this isn't really a war about Ukraine at all. It is a war about Russia. It's always been that. It's about Russia, about Russia's place in the world, its place in Europe, and of course, its de facto partnership with, it's de facto practically alliance now with China. China, of course, being seen as the great adversary, and this country with its enormous resources and its enormous potential power, trying to find some way to neutralize Russia in order to weaken China and to secure Western interests and hegemony even. And if we go back to the war in Ukraine, and we understand this fact that it's not really about Ukraine, it's about Russia, that a lot of the mysteries and uncertainties and problems trying to understand what Western policy was all about begin to answer themselves. The West never believed that Ukraine by itself could defeat Russia. That's not really what this was about at all. But what they did think is that they could defeat Russia using Ukraine as a proxy. Even Western publications now straightforwardly talk about this as a proxy war fought by the United States and its allies against Russia. And also, there was this enormous universal assumption that people still cling to, that the Russian economy is weak, one-dimensional. On the eve of the war, I actually remember reading on the White House website, an unnamed US official, possibly Jake Sullivan, actually used that word, that Russia has a one-dimensional economy purely based on energy. It's the gas station masquerading as a country. And the idea was, you give Ukraine lots and lots of weapons, and they were giving Ukraine weapons long before the war began, to an extent that has only gradually come to be understood. You give Ukraine weapons, you fight the Russians to a standstill in the actual battles in Ukraine. The assumption always is that the Russian army isn't anything much. It's certainly not up to the standard of Western armies. Russian military equipment isn't up to Western standards. And then you launch this scorched earth economic war against Russia. The French finance minister said this is going to be destroy the Russian economy. Biden talks about turning the ruble to rubble, all of those things. And that was the set of assumptions that they all made, that it was all going to end with a Russian collapse and regime change in Moscow, and the realization of all of these objectives, that you'd knock out Russia as a great power, as a political force, a geopolitical force to be reckoned with. And of course, it was all based on completely false assumptions about Russia, a country about which Westerners, to an astonishing degree, continue to be extremely uninformed. The Russian economy is not one-dimensional. It's very diversified. The country has a significant industrial and technology base. It is very rich in resources, including human resources. The political system is actually quite solid, and the population is both educated and very well informed. But of course, none of this are things that Westerners see. Even today, they still cling to this idea that, somehow if we keep going long enough, this is what Jack Watling was talking about, keep going long enough, we can somehow outlast the Russians, that this economic success that they've achieved with all of this military production and keeping their economy together and all that isn't real, that they've got a war economy now. And they are not living in a war economy. I mean, we've been speaking to people, Alex and I, who are in Russia. I was speaking yesterday to a person who's just come from there. And, this is an important, a well-known person in the West. And they all tell us the same thing. The economy is actually becoming stronger, not just in its military aspects, but in its civilian aspects as well. But that is what they thought. They thought that, there's a famous comment made by another Western leader who decided to take his armies into Russia in 1941, a gentleman with a mustache. I'm not going to mention his name, but he said just on the eve, all I have to do is kick on the door and the entire rotten structure will come tumbling down. And that is what they thought would happen this time. And of course it hasn't. And they're left astonished and bewildered, and they don't really know what to do.
Yeah, the Lithuanian prime minister yesterday, she said that the war did not go the way we hoped it would go. That's what she said. Didn't go the way we hoped it would go. Yeah. Didn't go according to plan. They actually thought that they were going to defeat Russia with proxy Ukraine, and they thought the economic war was going to bury the Russian economy. Like Alexander said, it didn't work out. We know that Ursula from the EU was meeting with Biden way back in November 2021, and they were planning out the sanctions roadmap. I mean, she said as much. This is not me. This is what she has said, that she was going to DC and they were planning out the sanctions. If Russia was to start something with Ukraine, they were putting all the sanctions together. And that was the plan. And it didn't work because they've internalized the whole gas station myth, gas station masquerading as a country myth. They've internalized all of that. And they internalize all the propaganda that the big mainstream media companies put out there. The siege of Kiev and the Kharkov counteroffensive. And once the Ukraine army approaches, because I remember when they were talking about the counteroffensive, once the Ukraine army starts to approach the Russian front lines, the Russians are just going to turn around and run away. And we know the plan was Melitopol in about, I believe, like 15 days.
15 days.
15 days, yeah.
15 days.
Yeah, because they thought the Russians were going to run away. Why? Because they believed the narrative of the Kharkiv and the Kherson counteroffensive. They believed that actually happened, that the Russians actually ran away. And they believed that because the mainstream media was feeding these stories out to the public. And I think that's something that, people need to understand, that a lot of the leaders in the West, from prime ministers to presidents down to the foreign ministries, they base their decisions, especially their foreign policy decisions, on what the BBC and the New York Times and the Washington Post report. I know this as a fact. They base a lot of their, if not all, if they're a smaller country, they're almost 100% reliant on what the big mainstream media reports. And that's what they base their decisions on. So when they read from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, from the BBC, from the Telegraph, that the Russian army is going to crumble once Ukraine approaches the front lines, they, okay, the New York Times said it, so it must be true. And that's why they all go along with it. And that's why you have the Lithuanian prime minister just coming out and saying, what happened? I thought, New York Times, you told me 15 days to Melitopol. BBC, that's what you reported. Bild, that's what you put out in your post. How come this didn't happen?
Yeah. Yeah. It is truly something else. And I was reading recently I believe it was the Wall Street, it was Bloomberg, I believe, talking about the Central Intelligence Agency having no ability to conduct any kind of intelligence on Xi Jinping in China, and how they were literally reading reports, the CIA was, that Chinese media were putting out and that Xi Jinping himself were putting out to understand what Xi Jinping is thinking and doing. And it would make sense then that the Western mainstream media is such a huge source of information for these leaders, given that it is the same anonymous officials, often intelligence, who likely don't have much to report on what Putin's next moves are, what Russia is really all about. And they give what they know to the mainstream media, or what they want to know. And then the politicians got to follow suit. So it would make a lot of sense that this is kind of how it goes. I guess maybe the better question is then, how did Russia really get here? Because 2023 appeared to be the year that was kind of a huge breakthrough for Russia. 2022, of course, there was, I think, kind of feeling out this conflict, how to fight it. And in 2023, it seemed like Russia cemented a lot of the things we already knew in 2022, but accelerated them. The failure of the sanctions, or the defeat of the sanctions, should we say, the defeat of the counteroffensive. How did Russia get here?
Well, I think they've been working on this for a very, very long time. But I think it's also important to remember that the Russians have never wanted a confrontation with the West. Certainly Putin has not. I mean, he has been making a lot of statements recently. And by the way, one should read the Chinese press to understand what Xi Jinping is saying. One should read what he says. We don't do this actually enough. And we don't analyze these articles properly, because we're always trying to second guess and find double meanings into what these leaders say. Whereas, in fact, when we read their speeches, Xi Jinping speeches, Vladimir Putin's speeches, straightforwardly. It's usually clear enough. But Putin has said this. He and the Russian government went beyond the extra mile over the last 20 years since he was leader, became 25 years that he was leader, to try to find some kind of accommodation with the West. They were warning increasingly that, the West was on a bad track, that things weren't going well, but they were always in the end looking for compromises. They were looking for compromises over Ukraine. They were looking for compromises over various other things. But gradually, as they began to see that that wasn't going to happen, and as the Russian economy began to recover after the 1990s crisis in the early 2000s, they began to take precautions and to plan ahead. And there was a very interesting meeting between Putin and the head of Rostec. Rostec, I should explain, is this gigantic Russian state-owned corporation. Brings together lots of big industrial plants, factories, laboratories, scientific institutions, and whatever. It's sometimes compared with Samsung in South Korea. It gives you some idea of the size of it. But he said, we're able to increase production in the way that we are in terms of weapons and other things because we have spent the last 15 years modernizing our factories. And that is exactly what they did. They modernized their factories. They built up their alternatives to SWIFT. They developed their connections with China and other countries in Asia. They built up their relations with India. They built up their relations with Saudi Arabia. They started from about the year 2013, a major reorganization and rearmament drive for their military, and gradually over time, they built it up. Now, the essential thing to understand is that when the conflict began in 2022, that rearmament drive was nowhere near completed. It was still very much a work in progress. I mean, you're looking at, numbers of tanks, numbers of infantry fighting vehicles, numbers of aircraft, numbers of troops under full-time contract. They were still relatively small. What has happened is that this war has unleashed funding within Russia to accelerate this process and to magnify this process at a far faster rate than the Kremlin had planned before. And the Russians discovered, to their own surprise, that their economy could do it. They discovered that, in fact, their industrial plants, their laboratories, the numbers of their engineers, there were many more of them, better located, than even they themselves had realized. And this is not a mystery; it's an admission, and that they've been admitting themselves, and that their ability to absorb the sanctions shock turned out to be much greater than they had even themselves realized. So this is why we have come there, and this is not new, by the way. It has happened repeatedly in terms of Russian history, that they've prepared for a war over a long period. Then the war comes. It happened in 1812 with Napoleon, happened in 1941 with the Second World War. They prepared for it, and then they themselves are surprised that their level of preparation has been as great as it has been. And this is where we are. Now, I have to come back to what Alex was saying about this Lithuanian foreign minister, that the war hasn't turned out exactly as we expected. It irresistibly, I have to say this, reminded me of the Japanese emperor telling the people of Japan in August 1945, as he announces Japan's unconditional capitulation, that the war has turned out not entirely to Japan's advantage. I think it's the same kind of bizarre language.
Yeah.
It's when you go to Russia and you meet you meet people and you talk to them there, you understand that they have the ability to do these things, like what Alexander was saying, but they do very much underestimate their ability to do these things. And all it takes is just to go there and you understand that this is not it's not like a country or culture that's boasting about, well, we could produce 10 million this and 5 million that. It's very, very low key when it comes to stuff like that. And then when they realize that they can produce these weapons at this scale, everyone's surprised. But they have the ability, they have the capacity to do it. Absolutely. And the analysts in the West, they should have realized this. I mean, you figure these think tanks are getting so much money. You have so many analysts there. You would think that some of these people would have traveled to Russia. They would have seen the tremendous potential and ability that Russia has, the human capital that they have, and you would come out with the conclusion that this country can really crank up their weapons production. I mean, we were doing shows even before the conflict where Alexander explained it. He was like, the Russian economy is like a big wheel, and it's big and it's heavy. It takes a little bit to start, but once it gets momentum, there's no stopping it. And that's very much what we're seeing now play out in real time. And it just amazes me that all of the money and supposedly all the expertise and all the analysis that's in DC and in London, and still to this day, they can't figure out this country. And you could just take a trip, spend a couple of years there, and you'll start to get an understanding of it. But I really think that a lot of it is just their own bias. They have such a visceral hatred, and it emotionally pains them to just admit that they're good at doing what they do, that they just can't bring themselves to get there. And that's what I think it blocks them continuously when they try to figure out what Russia's capable of or what they're up to. It's this bias, this hatred, where the Russians are the opposite. The Russians they're reading what the collective West media is saying. They're reading the articles. They're studying the posts. They're trying to understand how they're thinking. They're trying to understand their next move. You go to someone in DC, one of these think tankers, and you tell them Putin's very smart. Oh my God, he's not smart. He's the worst. Don't tell me he's smart. I don't want to hear it. It's like you've hurt them, like you've emotionally damaged them. That's how propagandized. That's how emotional. That's how damaged they become by everything they've been conditioned to understand about this country, its people, and its leaders. So I think that plays a huge role.
Well, perhaps we can now talk about what to expect in 2024. I know in your programs you have talked about the possibility of this missile campaign representing some kind of offensive. While I know, Alexander, you've talked about how this fits well within Russia's key objective and policy around Ukraine, which is attrition. And so with that, then, this idea of offensive versus attrition, what can we expect from this conflict in 2024? We were just looking at how the Western mainstream media is viewing this. They're talking about 2025, right? Going on the offensive in 2025. That's more than a year from now, ostensibly. And a lot is, I predict, or I assume will happen. So I don't know, Alexander, maybe you can begin with what can we expect?
Well, I think for the moment, at least, we're going to see continued attrition. I think that is the approach that the Russians have been following now for the whole of the war, and it's worked well for them. They've seen Western arsenals deplete. They've seen Ukraine's military degrade. They're gradually now moving over from what they call active defense to the situation where they're able to increase their areas of control. They're not yet started anything remotely like a general offensive, and I think this is a point which needs to be made clear. But they will continue to pummel away at the Ukrainians, keep the Ukrainians busy, prevent the Ukrainians resting, refitting, rebuilding their army to the extent that they can. They will continue hitting Ukrainian industrial facilities. They will continue chasing and destroying to the extent that they can and degrading the Ukrainian air defense system. And it's very difficult for us as outsiders to know exactly how the Russians intend to plan this thing. The one thing that I think we can say about the Russian military is that the people who run it are professionals. I mean, they're people who've studied war, who worked through the various academies of the general staff, who are highly educated in war planning. And at the same time, the military people and the political leadership, are relatively risk averse. They're not going to take big gambles and extraordinary risks, which might upset the calculus of the war. So they're going to continue grinding. They're going to continue advancing steadily and methodically until, I suspect, the point comes when they sense that Ukrainian ability to continue to provide the kind of resistance which Ukraine is still able to provide now becomes exhausted. And then I think we will see a much bigger offensive, and we will start to see the big armor divisions, the mechanized divisions, the ones with the tanks and the infantry fighting vehicles, which I haven't really seen for a long time in this war. They appeared briefly at the start, then they were pulled back in April 2022 when it looked like there was going to be a peace. But at that point, they will probably come back, and there'll be much bigger numbers, many more of them that time. And at some point, I still believe that kind of offensive will come, because wars have to end. If there's not going to be a diplomatic solution, there has to be a military one. And I personally cannot see how you can achieve a victory without going on the offensive at some point. And I think that this is probably the calculation in Moscow. Now, what the time frame is, I don't know. One Russian official, who's Vladimir Saldo, who is a civilian official in Kherson region, he's said he thinks the war will end in about 6 months' time. That this is when, this big Russian offensive will come. Another Russian official, a military officer, also gave about the same sort of time frame. Others think it'll be later than that, maybe August, September, conveniently close notice to the American election. There's even reports that were circulating some weeks and months ago that it might be in 2025. And of course, if you believe Nikkei in Japan, the Russians are planning for a 5-year war. That was supposedly what Putin said to Xi Jinping in March. I don't believe the last, by the way. I don't know what the evidence for that is. So I think that at some point there will be a big offensive. Will it be this year? I think personally that is very likely, but I am not going to second guess Russian plans.
Yeah, and I think we have to wait and see short term, like in the next, definitely the next week, we have to see what Congress is going to do.
Yeah,
with the 61 billion to Ukraine. We'll see what'll happen there, and then in February, based on what Congress does, we'll see what they do with the Russian frozen assets and the 300 billion. So I think we have to look at those two events and see what happens. And you could be looking at a significant amount of money going to Ukraine, which would obviously prolong the conflict. So we have to see what's going to happen there.
To close on Ukraine, maybe briefly, summarize, if you could, the logic of attrition for Russia at this very moment in 2024. Given all that we talked about, a lot of people come up to me and say, Danny, why doesn't Russia just end this thing now with all of the military advantages, the economic stability? Why is it that Russia continues to fight attrition when all indications are that Ukraine is on the ropes and that the United States and its NATO vassals, so to speak, its partners are also on the ropes?
You see, this is where I think, and it's something which Alex and I were talking about right from the start of the war. I mean, neither of us is a military person, not by any stretch of the imagination, but most of us are familiar with political, philosophical thinking in Russia. The thing to understand about the Russians is that for them, war, which is something that they are very familiar with, Russians understand war. I mean, it's very much ingrained and part of their history. War for them is a political thing. It's not about, big offensives, seizing cities. It's about destroying the enemy so that the enemy is not able to continue resistance and to come back. And the point about attrition is that it achieves two things. Firstly, it weakens Ukraine to the point that when Ukraine is defeated, it cannot resume the war at any future point. If you just send large tank armies deep into Ukraine, you're going to suffer huge casualties yourself. You will win, but a quick victory is scarcely ever a fully decisive one. So the Russians want to attrition Ukraine, as they put it, to demilitarize Ukraine, to grind it down to the point where it no longer can ever be, again, a threat to them. And of course, the other political dimension, which the Russians are always far more conscious of than people in the West understand, is that they always look at the political and diplomatic factors, sentiment within Russia itself. They don't want huge casualties because that might not be entirely successful. It might not go down well with the Russian population. It might put major strains on Russian society and on the Russian economy. And again, this is something the Russian government does think about, but also Russia's diplomatic and political alliances, its capacity to keep not just China, which is, I think the Russians have gradually come to feel is a steady friend, but other countries like India, the global south, the Middle East states, to keep them on side, to say to them, look, we are measured, moderate people. We are going to proceed in a measured, moderate way. We're not going to rush to victory. We're always open to negotiations and to discussions with the other side. But of course, until we get those serious offers of negotiation, we have no choice but to keep fighting. And so playing it slow and playing it long works to the Russians' advantage in multiple terms. It means their military is getting stronger rather than expending its military power on, with huge losses. It means Ukraine is getting weaker. It means the West is also getting weaker. It means that diplomatically, Russia is getting stronger. And politically, the government itself in Russia is getting stronger. Now, if you are classically trained, as I once was, by the way, and you know your Greek and Roman history, you will know that the Romans had an expression for this, festina lente, make haste slowly. And that exactly sums up the Russian approach.
Yeah, look at what Russia has accomplished, to be honest, in 2 years. And Ukraine is just one part of this big war. And Lavrov always would call it a hybrid war. He would always mention the conflict in Ukraine, he would say this is a hybrid war with the West because it had many facets. And just this year, you had BRICS with Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Ethiopia, Egypt.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a big deal, and this was not going to happen if Russia didn't play the game the way they played it in the beginning of the conflict, by taking it slow, understanding what they needed to do step by step, and not just going in there and breaking everything. And so I think they had other goals in mind. And I'm positive that they were liaising with the Chinese, with the Indians, Brazil, South Africa, and they were talking about these things. And I think they saw Ukraine as just an important, significant part to something that's much bigger. And I think the conflict in Ukraine, the way the West reacted, just accelerated the momentum behind BRICS. I mean, the West really did it to themselves in their reaction, because they got emotional about everything. And, you know, the BRICS, they just played it cool. And now here you are with 2024, and you have Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia in the same organization, with China there, the manufacturing, the energy, the commodities, the population.
Yeah, no, I mean, and when I'm asked this, I go, well, why would Russia do anything differently, given exactly as you both stated? You both remember the beginning of this conflict in 2022. The United States and NATO, they tried their hardest to basically shift public opinion completely against Russia. They tried to move the entire world against Russia. And now, in just under 2 years, Russia has flipped that completely on its head, where Russia indeed has gained the trust, not just of Russian people, not just the region, but really the world has seen just how this conflict has actually gone and what the risks are for the world, not because of Russia, not because of anything Russia was doing or has done, but because of how this conflict was provoked and then how it was fought on the US and NATO side. And all of these countries that you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and many more, have made calculations that they need to have what the Western mainstream media sometimes says is an insurance policy. They need to have options. They need to have alternatives. And that is a huge victory for Russia. But speaking of the Middle East, I think it's fitting to end here, given how this, it gives me a headache sometimes just thinking about what's going on right now in the Middle East and West Asia, because of course you have the situation in Gaza, a months-long campaign now that Israel, with the US's unconditional support, has been waging, a military campaign, a ground operation. Now there appears to be, I know, Alex, you have talked about this, both of you have talked about this on the Duran, this shift to a low intensity conflict. But as the civilian casualties, especially on the Palestinian side, are just enormous, you have what I've seen as a shift from this conflict being relatively contained, although you did have Hezbollah from the very beginning being quite involved to the north. But now it seems like, as there's this shift to a low intensity conflict regionally and globally, this conflict's ramifications are growing. We were talking before the program, Alexander, of all of the various assassinations and terrorist attacks, from the Christmas killing by an Israeli drone of Saeed Razi Mousavi, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps leader, who's instrumental in its operations with Syria. You have Salah al-Arori, the one of the top Hamas leaders, killed in Lebanon. And of course, you have now the ISIS, supposedly ISIS has taken responsibility for what happened in Iran on the celebration or commemoration of Qasem Soleimani's murder at the hands of the United States a few years back. Over 100 people killed there in that attack. And of course, you have what's going on in the Red Sea, which is also quite intense. The U.S. Attacking Houthi positions, and of course, the Houthis doing quite a lot of damage to the economic activity that goes through that part of the world. So Maybe we can begin, Alexander, with you. Your impressions of where this is actually going, and is this another quagmire? It's feeling more and more like a quagmire that is without really an end in sight.
It is a it is a quagmire. I don't know whether it's without any end in sight, but it is definitely a quagmire, and it is one which is entirely the product. And I think this really does need to be said. It is entirely the product of US policy, or rather the absence of any coherent US policy. Now, it is very interesting. I'm going to put it no more highly than that just at this particular moment, ISIS, that in some ways convenient organization, has just resurfaced and is now claiming responsibility for this really terrible attack in Iran. Now, we've been talking about this whole situation in the Middle East, in the Duran, ever since the events of the 7th of October began. And we have said on the Duran many times that the approach taken by the United States and by Israel of marching into Gaza and trying to achieve a military solution to the problem of Hamas was a mistaken one. We suggested that perhaps a better approach, in fact, definitely a better approach, would have been a diplomatic one which sought to use the mechanisms of the Security Council to get the civilian hostages that have been taken released, to try to establish investigations of what happened on the 7th of October, to bring people into account. There was a lot of sympathy at that time in October for the Israeli position. It was inevitable that if Israel and the United States went for a military solution, that support would be forfeited. And it was. They went for a military solution. They have carried out this terrible war in Gaza. Tens of thousands of people have been killed. Massive destruction has been caused. Everybody has seen all of the pictures and films of what's been going on in Gaza. There's a member of my family, a relative of mine, who works in the European Parliament. Yes, I know people who work in the European Parliament. She has been massively disillusioned, both by the actions that Israel has taken and by the stance the United States and the European Union have taken. And the collective West, the United States, Israel, have seen political support for them in the region and globally, as reflected in repeated votes in the General Assembly and the Security Council of the United Nations. And again, Alex and I were talking about this. They've seen global opinion turned against them. So you start to get the sense that there are tensions within the administration. They're also aware that this policy is unpopular with a large fraction of the Democratic Party's coalition in what is looking like a very fraught election year. So you sense that one faction says, we want to stop. We want to find a way out. We can't agree to a ceasefire in Gaza because that would be humiliating. So let's try to get the Israelis to dial down. Let's get them to talk about a low-intensity conflict. Let's get them to pull out their tanks and their infantry fighting vehicles and 5 brigades and all of that kind of thing. And let's, at the same time, pull back one of these aircraft carriers we sent to the region, which has been hovering there in the Eastern Mediterranean, not doing very much, but through its mere presence, adding to the sense of crisis and tension and fear that a strike might be underway against Iran and something of that kind might be on the way. So you get those forces of relative moderation. And I stress relative because there's no real conviction behind this. They urge a pullback, and you see the signs of a pullback. And then as soon as that happens, you see the other push from the other side, those who still hanker for a larger war, people like John Bolton, who are now openly demanding a military strike on Iran. You just published an article in the Daily Telegraph in Britain calling for a strike on Iran. And a whole series of events start to happen, even as this sort of retreat appears to be underway. which points in the diametrically opposite direction towards escalation. So you see Mousavi, the Iranian official, being killed. You see an important Hamas official being assassinated in Beirut. You have this major bomb attack in Iran, which kills 100 people, close to the grave of General Soleimani, whom the Americans assassinated. And now you've had this statement from various Western governments, orchestrated by the United States, giving warnings to the Houthis over the events in the Red Sea. So you see that the pendulum swung slightly towards, I won't say peace, but to a certain degree of de-escalation. And now it's been pushed all the way back with immense energy in the opposite direction towards escalation and war. And that tells us how incredibly dangerous this whole situation is. But it also tells us again that there is a vacuum at the heart of US policy. There is nobody in Washington who has full control of the situation and who's able to chart a consistent course. Whenever there's a move in one direction, another faction comes in and pushes it back in the other. And this is incredibly dangerous, especially in a region like this, and it promises a further deterioration.
Yeah, and that was the danger of moving all those military assets to the region. I mean, once you start moving all those military assets there, it's you give an opening to the war hawks, to the neocons, and they're not going to just give up with this opportunity that they have in front of them to finally get this big war in the Middle East that they've been angling for so many decades. And because you don't have a strong executive, you don't really know who's calling the shots in the White House. You get these decisions where they're just moving all of these carriers and ships and all these weapons. They're just moved right into the Mediterranean, right into the region, into the Middle East. And now it's going to be incredibly difficult to pull that stuff back. I don't see it happening. I mean, my fear is that these people that want this war are not going to let it go until they get this war, with all the costs that it's going to inflict, all the damage it's going to do, even the damage it's going to do on the U.S. and even to Biden's reelection. Yeah. But they've got everything there. That's the problem. They're sitting in D.C. and they're saying, "Look, we have everything in position. We've moved everything to the region. Now's our time to strike." That's what they're saying to themselves. And so any little pullback is going to be met with a whole ton of pushback.
Yeah. Yeah. What's been interesting to see unfold is that everything that the United States has done in response to Israel's response to October 7th, in response to this campaign, has almost been a kind of escalation, a provocation, similar to how NATO was encircling Russia to provoke such a conflict in Ukraine, and then, of course, using Ukraine to spark the conflicts of all conflicts, so to speak. It appears that while I believe surely Yemen and the Houthis are taking a stand very much independently, the rest of this process going on appears to be, as you said, Alex, it feels like almost opportunism. Like Israel's doing this right now. Well, we might as well get what we want out of this too, because when you have Hezbollah, these assassinations, Hezbollah, and then what happened in Iran, it does feel like the U.S., the neocons in particular, are almost giving zero options for these forces to do anything but engage more and get deeper and deeper into a regional conflict with the United States and with Israel.
I think this is absolutely correct. I mean, I think this is the tragedy of this whole conflict right from the beginning, and it's been the tragedy not for a long time, not just since the 7th of October, that whenever you get something happen. And in the Middle East, something always happens. I mean, until there is a general resolution of the crises in the Middle East, which is not impossible, it's not unachievable, but nobody is seriously trying to do that. Until there is a general resolution, there are lots of armed men, lots of violent people in the Middle East, and sooner or later something bad is going to happen. And whenever something bad happens, as night follows day, those who should be acting to try to keep things under control work to make them worse. Now, I mean, we were talking earlier in the program about Belgorod. I mean, Putin commented about the events in Belgorod, and just contrast the difference between what he said and the reaction of the Americans and the Israelis. He said, this is, on Russian television, he said, the attack on Belgorod was intended to provoke us into doing the same thing, to attacking civilian locations in Ukraine. And yes, we can do that. We can attack civilian places in Kiev, in any city in Ukraine. But we are not going to do that. And we're not going to do that for two reasons. Firstly, because doing that is wrong. But secondly, because it is what the other side wants us to do. We're not going to do what the other side wants us to do. We're not going to be manipulated. In the conflicts in the Middle East, there are some people who not only want to provoke conflict, but who, whenever something happens, like 7th October, they come and they insist that there must be exactly that kind of uncontrolled escalation, which Putin avoided over the events in Belgorod. And of course, it leads you ultimately into failure and a blind alley, and everybody can see it. But in Washington, calls for restraint, and this is a real problem, never seem in the end to prevail. Always the odds seem to be stacked in favor of those who demand escalation. And that is why, as Alex rightly said, we are heading steadily towards a major smash in the Middle East, which will not be to the advantage of the United States or to Israel or to the collective West. We've had 30 years of war in the Middle East. Every single one of these wars has ended badly for the West. Declining influence, declining prestige, declining positions in the Middle East, lots of losses, lots of disillusionment in the West. But nonetheless, the calls for escalation, for more conflict, are always there.
Yeah. Nothing more to add there, Alexander. Yeah, it's going to be so hard for them to pull back everything they moved into position. I hope they do. I hope the U.S. pulls back everything that they've got in the region, but it's going to be impossible for them to do it.
Yeah. Then why would the United States do this? Because I was under the impression for many years now, especially after the conflict in Ukraine became a special military operation, so to speak. But even well before that, it was quite clear that the U.S. political establishment, the neoconservative foreign policy establishment, but really the entirety of, especially the American political establishment, military establishment, are moving away from West Asia, away from the Middle East, toward Russia and China. An admission, I think Afghanistan taught a pretty hard lesson. But even before 2021, there was movements away, almost a deprioritization, so much so that I think the U.S. was kind of caught with its pants down a bit when October 7th happened, because the U.S. has a lot of military installations and they have a heavy presence militarily, but they weren't really doing much. I mean, they were causing chaos and whatnot, but they weren't in an offensive position, and it wasn't being prioritized. So why then would, if there are these grand plans for a broader war with Russia, broader war with China, why would West Asia, the Middle East, just because of what happened on October 7th. Significant. Israel's, of course, campaign just absolutely kind of mind-boggling in terms of its scale of damage. But at the same time, we know the U.S. is pretty okay with that kind of thing. So why then would an investment in West Asia be so much of a priority, given Iran wasn't trying to have any kind of conflict for this entire period? And it's been said in certain circles of the foreign policy establishment that a conflict in Iran would be absolutely disastrous in and of itself.
I mean, you're absolutely correct. I mean, the United States, in theory, has been trying to prioritize its confrontation with China. And getting bogged down in the Middle East makes absolutely no sense from an American point of view if you follow that kind of calculus. And you could argue, I mean, if you accepted the kind of absurd thinking that we were talking about Russian weakness, why a conflict with Russia might work to your advantage in terms of success against China. But again, since that has not worked out, logically, rationally, if you follow through with your own logic, you should be trying to find a way out of the conflict with Russia, and so that, again, you can focus on China. But that, of course, assumes that you're a rational person, and the neocons are not. This is the fundamental problem. Now, the neocons want a confrontation in the Middle East for a variety of reasons. Firstly, because straightforwardly, they have wanted a war with Iran for 30 years, longer, in fact. So always they come back to that visceral need to have a confrontation with Iran. Alex was talking earlier in the program about their visceral feelings, their loathing of Russia, their loathing of Putin, the fact that they're driven by that kind of emotional feeling. It's the same with Iran. In some cases, it's even stronger with some of them where Iran is concerned. So there is this issue. So this is now the opportunity to start a war. The second is that the neocons have a cultured, not just the Washington bureaucracy, but much of the thinking community, if you like, in the West, to see restraint and moderation and calculation as a sign of weakness. So whereas Putin, who is a very strong leader, and let me mistake about this, could say, I'm not going to do what the other side wants me to do. I'm not going to do something wrong over Belgorod. And nobody in Russia thinks that this is a sign of weakness. They see it instead as a sign of strength. In Washington, any sign of softness is immediately criticized as a sign of weakness. And the idea is you strike at Iran, because if you don't strike at Iran, the Chinese are going to think you're weak. And for that reason, you must strike at Iran. You must show always that you are strong and that you will respond belligerently and violently and in this kind of way. Now, the Chinese actually don't think like that at all. But that is the kind of thing that people in Washington say. When there was the Istanbul negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, which almost ended in peace, the rationalization that the US gave for wrecking the peace talks is that it would reward aggression by Russia, and that would encourage China. So you can see the kind of mindset that comes into play there. So that is the second factor. And then the third factor, again, from a neocon perspective, is that neocons are geared towards wanting conflict and war. It's almost irrelevant for them where that conflict is, be it with Russia, be it with Iran, be it in China, be it with someone else, because war is what makes them strong in Washington. And perhaps for them, that is the single most important consideration of all.
Yeah, war is what keeps them in power. And they're all over the place in the permanent state. They are the permanent state. That's why for them, it doesn't matter which administration it is, Republican, Democrat, they don't care. They're going to be there, and they especially have control of the State Department. The State Department is where they run the show. Whether it's Obama, whether it's Bush, whether it was Trump, it doesn't matter. They're a permanent fixture in the State Department. So when they put out the policy, that's what's going to be followed. So I mean, yeah, it's like Alexander says, it's they always have this need as well to. It's as if the world is a bunch of children and they're the parent, and you're not behaving. We always have to. This country's not behaving the way we want it to behave, and they actually use that word often. Unless Russia changes their behavior, then we're not going to lift the sanctions. Unless Russia changes their behavior, then we're not going to stop sending weapons. Or the same with Iran. They have to change their behavior. And it's this constant that you see coming out of the neocons and out of DC. It's always about, projecting their strength. We don't want to look weak. We don't want to reward bad behavior. If we don't hit Iran, well, then we're rewarding bad behavior. And then China's going to see that Iran is getting rewarded for their bad behavior. And then we're going to have to punish China as well. That's why they're going sanctions crazy. That's why they go sanctions crazy. I was reading today, just a couple of hours ago, that they're now going to sanction North Korea and Iran and Russia again. I mean, to what end? But because they're not behaving, they're misbehaving. Because North Korea sold Russia weapons or something. I mean, it's you're not behaving the way we want you to behave. So now we're going to punish you. But all this stuff is exactly what's driving the world towards BRICS. It's all of these things that the rest of the world, the 80% of the world, is just like, I've had enough. Had enough of this stuff. And they have a choice, and that's why they're going the route of BRICS. It's just one final point, which we haven't mentioned. I mean, and we did a show on this, me and Alexander, France has been kicked out of Africa. Niger kicked them out. This would have never happened 5 years ago. This would have never happened 3 years ago. Because they now have a choice. Countries now have an option. And that's why we're seeing all this change. And that's why we're going to see a very bumpy 2024, to say the least, a very turbulent 2024.
Yeah, no, it's you're exactly right. And I think the combination of having that example of a Russian victory, ostensibly, I know we're still in attrition, it has an over, but it's basically over, and the world can see exactly all the damage that was caused by the other side, and all of the prospects that Russia brings. And the same goes for all of these conflicts. I mean, China has not been deterred, has not been weakened, despite all the media clamor of collapse here, collapse there. There's no collapse anywhere with regard to China. And then in West Asia, I mean, however this is going to go, if there is any kind of regional conflagration, I cannot predict that this will go well for the United States or for Israel. I mean, Israel has already suffered, I think, mightily in the court of public opinion, but it's going to suffer much more if it does have to contend with a more interventionist Hezbollah or Iran or any other force, for that matter, that is quite angry with what they have done. So with all that said, though, I know I've kept you a while. I'm wondering if you had about 5-10 minutes for some questions. I saw a lot of questions coming in. I do have someone from Patreon named Rodolfo. He wants to know if the possibility for the Strait of Gibraltar becoming a hot spot like the Red Sea. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I'm going to say straight away, I haven't heard anything about this, and let's not talk too much about. Let's not start putting ideas into people's minds. I've not heard of anything happening in the Straits of Gibraltar, but so it's unstable and volatile world. And it's not far from some very unstable and volatile places, potentially, yes. But I'm not going to say I've heard anything about that, and I don't want to start making predictions of that nature. Right.
And we have a question here, too. So, Alexander, without the US or the EU coming to the table, why would Russia not take it all?
Well, they
Says
might very well.
Borislav Katsarov. Thank you.
Yeah, they might very well end up doing precisely that. I mean, this is the thing. The Russians are saying, look, we've set out what our objectives are in this conflict. We've laid them out. We set them out right at the beginning, that they're demilitarization of Ukraine, denuclearization, denazification, protection for Russians in Ukraine. We're prepared to talk about how to achieve that. We are now incredibly mistrustful of the West and of the Ukrainians. The kind of guarantees that we would be looking for are now going to be extremely harsh. But, we are still prepared to talk. If the other side are not prepared to talk, the Russians are saying straightforwardly, we're going to go and achieve it all by ourselves, by military means. We have the means and we will do it. And it could very well end up in exactly the kind of scenario that you've outlined.
And last one, here's from Darren Alivi. Thank you, Darren. Do you think the Russians will decide to put the Ukraine conflict to bed after the presidential election in March?
Well, in a word, no. I don't think so. I think that if you think this, you have not been tracking Putin's comments. I mean, bear in mind that this is not a war that he wanted. It's a war that he sought to avoid. And he's made it absolutely clear that as far as he's concerned, it was not a war of choice, that the Western powers were aiming all along to bring Ukraine into NATO, that they were going to use NATO against Russia to undermine Russian security. And for him, as he's put it very straightforwardly, and I think this isn't just Putin, I think this is the consensus, the priority remains to resolve the problem of Russia's western borders, to make sure that those are secure so that the country can develop economically without fear of something bad coming to it from the West. And I think until that is achieved, this war will continue. And it is not going to be achieved by March. So the war will go on beyond March. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt at all.
Yeah. Alex, do you have any comments and any of the questions before we before I let you guys go?
No, I just think that Russia isn't really putting timelines based on elections, either the Russian or the US, to be honest. I mean, maybe the war will end and be timed with the US elections, maybe, but I would say that's probably more coincidence than Russian planning a certain time period. I don't think they're sitting there saying we got to end this war right before the elections in the US. They're not operating like that.
Indeed. Well, you both have been very generous with your time. I really appreciate you both coming out. I hope you have really good evenings, restful evenings. Anything that you want to promote, please do. And yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, great pleasure. Go on, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Just follow us on all our channels. We're pretty much everywhere: YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, Alexander's channel, my channel, the Duran, 3 channels on all the major platforms. I believe there'll be links in the description box as well. And that's it. Just subscribe and follow us.
Definitely. I'll definitely put those in at the moment after I let you guys go. Thanks so much again, and hope to talk to you soon. Have a good one. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye. All right, everyone. That was good. Yes, I do need to get those links in there. So, everyone, I just wanted to keep you on for a little longer to get some announcements out before I let you go. Okay, so I'm actually gonna put in the Duran. I'm gonna tag their channel here on YouTube so you can follow them. And then there you can go to all their other platforms. They're on Telegram, they're on Odyssey, they're on Rumble, they're on Rockfin, they're on all the major platforms if you're not following them yet. at the Duran. So I did that in the video description. With that said, okay, a few announcements. All right. And then I'll get to some shout outs, of course, as I do as a customary practice. So next week, it's likely that I won't be streaming again until next week. Streams are going to get a little fewer and farther between just because I got a few things going on over the next couple months. But the next stream, there might be 2 streams next week. One with George Galloway. I'm in talks with him about an appearance on this program, and then Michael Hudson, the economist, also as well. That should be happening a week. Those both should be happening around a week from today, the 11th and 12th, if I am lucky to get both. Okay, so keep a lookout for those streams. Of course, there'll be clips from this stream coming up soon. I'll probably do 2 because there are 2 timely topics here, 2 in the next couple days, probably Friday and Sunday. So look out for the clips, of course. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe button, notifications bell for this channel and for this stream, of course. And you can support this work in the new year 2024 in many different ways. The best way is, of course, to become a member on Patreon. I do read out questions, do take suggestions of guests, do provide resources, do provide a free copy of my book in PDF form on American exceptionalism on Patreon. So you can go to the video description, patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong, and subscribe for an annual amount or a monthly amount. Do subscribe to the free newsletter on Substack to get notifications, Telegram, as well as in the video description to do that. Other paid options include Buy Me a Coffee, PayPal. I saw a few people do that during the stream on PayPal. Thanks so much, and I will shout you out soon. And of course, you can become a member on YouTube here for $3.99 per month. All the paid options from Substack, YouTube, Patreon, etc. I do try to give as close to the same perks as possible, but some of these features, like YouTube, have a few limitations to that. But nonetheless, you will get early notifications, and you will be able to support this work in the way that you see fit for you. And I really appreciate everyone who already does. I want to shout out first the moderators. Thank you so much. Let me see who is moderating today, or who's still here at least. Valley, thanks so much for coming through as a moderator. Who else do we have here? We have Ware. Thanks so much for moderating today. Let's see who else is here moderating. Are those the only 2 folks moderating today? Let's see. Oh, some people said my mic was cutting in and out. I hope that stopped. Did that stop, everyone? Give me a please give me an indication that stopped. I did not see that in the chat. Anyway, I hope that stopped while the stream was going. Let's see. Anyone else moderating? No, I think it was just Valley and Ware. Not that I'm complaining. All right. So people said I didn't notice it. Thanks so much. So, it said I missed the chat by Casey. Oh, did I? Was it a question by Casey? I'm so sorry if I did. It was hard keeping up. Honestly, let me see. Oh, darn. Sorry about that. The thing is, I was reading very fast and it wasn't in question form. If Russia were to gain enough territory to link up with Hungary, would they leave NATO and the EU? Because I think, oh, wow, that is unfortunate. I'm sorry, Casey. Anthony got away with it. I will be sure. They will be back. All right. They will be back. If you want to, I don't know if you can get refunds for these super chats. If you do want to do that and send it over to them as a super sticker or whatever, or I think you can do it super thanks to their channel and then ask the question. I think they do question and answers too. But nonetheless, that's a very good question. One that I'm not even so sure the answer of. So it would have been interesting. So sorry about that. We will be back together. And that question will remain relevant. For sure over the course of the months to come. So I'm going to just give a shout out to some folks here. No new Patreon members during the stream, it doesn't look like, but we do have 2 PayPal. No sent $20. Thank you, No. And we had Paul Wernke give $20 as well on PayPal. Thank you so much for that. And then in terms of, Rodolfo, I believe you were the person who asked, you're a member, a super sticker contributor, and a Patreon subscriber. So your contributions are very much appreciated. Thank you so much for the super sticker. And I tried to have your question answered. It was a very brief answer, but yeah, it looks like most of us don't see anything like that happening in the Strait of Gibraltar anytime soon, notwithstanding changes in the global situation. So Sparky asked, terrific, Danny, Alex, Alexander, thanks so much, Sparky. Sparky said again, earlier today, I made a poorly worded super chat on the Duran about Javier Melli consulting with economist Mark Blythe. I meant that Blythe had a handle on nation-state economic recovery, not Malay. Okay. Thank you for correcting the record. Boris Katsarev had the question. Thank you so much, Boris, again. Pamela, thank you so much for your very, very, very generous super chat. Thank you for coming. Valley, thank you for being a member and a moderator. Of course, it's always appreciated when you give super stickers too. Grassy Knoll, welcome back, Grassy Knoll. Thanks so much for the super sticker. Again, I want to apologize. Casey Anthony got away with it. Thank you so much for the super chat. We have Tatiana Kononov. Happy New Year, Duran and Danny. Thank you for all you do. Thank you so much for coming, Tatiana. Appreciate it. Darren asked the question. Thank you so much, Darren, for your question. Sierra, Resistance TV Pod is live now. 7 p.m. Brilliant guests. Okay. Thank you so much, Sierra, for that. Cha-cha-ha-ha 999 says, believe it or not, the Imam Mahdi will eventually present his credentials to the world. Those who came to scoff will stay to pray. Benjamin Cream shared many details. Not sure what you're referring to there, cha-cha-ha-ha 999, but I do appreciate your contributions. I am Valentina, says Danny, and the Duran. I am beside myself, hopefully in a good way. Valentina. I am Valentina. And then we have Heinz Stalder. Right back at you. I hope. Thank you so much. Okay, well, that is that for the supers. I want to first say also, okay, before you leave here today, what I want you to do, all right, if you can, I want you to go to the chat. The chat now has the Rumble link. I'm also going to put it here. That is my Rumble channel. And I want all of you to go to Rumble, search my name, or go to this link in the chat. And I want you all to follow me there. We all know what happened to Richard Medhurst and so many other channels here on YouTube. I believe Richard Medhurst was completely demonetized. There have been others who have been completely taken off. I am not going to act like I am above that, even though it hasn't happened to me yet. And so with that said, it is very important that you all go to Rumble. Here is the link for all 3,800 plus of you who are still here, for you to go to Rumble and follow me there, because there may come a time where that is the primary platform. I do have to start to brainstorm how to get more people onto Rumble from YouTube from in the days to come. Okay, so please do that. That would be greatly appreciated. And yes, please do go to Rumble. So there it is. You can also, of course, go to Rockfin. Okay, we have 32 people watching on Rockfin. I want to thank all of you for doing so. Just search my name on Rockfin if that is your preferred platform, Danny Dhaiphong, and you find my channel there. So, with all that said, again, next week is likely when I'll be back on. It might be mid to late next week. I am trying to coordinate with George Galloway to have him on the show, to return on the program to give his thoughts on these issues, as well as Michael Hudson to do the same in about a week's time. Before that, stay tuned for the clips. I want to wish all of you also a happy 2024. I have not streamed since the passage of the new year. And so 2024 will indeed be a very, very eventful one globally, with all of the ways in which these flashpoints in the world are playing out. The United States, its imperial apparatus, its military apparatus, its foreign policy establishment is digging and digging and digging its grave deeper and deeper and deeper into these conflicts, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's what's happening around Gaza in West Asia, or whether it's in the Asia Pacific, where this so-called cooling period is likely to end very soon. And that article, I forgot to mention the article that Jack Watling, he's actually a senior research fellow for land warfare at the United Services Institute. He's basically an apparatchik of the UK foreign policy establishment. He ended the article saying, and if a loss in Ukraine ends up demonstrating that the West cannot meet a single challenge to the world's security architecture, its adversaries will hardly believe it can deal with multiple crises at once. And we're looking at 3 at least in the coming weeks and months ahead. 3 major geopolitical military crises that, of course, always lend themselves to economic fallout and all kinds of other ramifications, socially, diplomatically, politically. This is truly an unfavorable position for the U.S. empire to be in. It is truly an unfavorable position for the ruling elite that dictates and controls this empire. But I do want to say one thing. I've been seeing it around, especially among progressives and leftists. There's a lot of pessimism going around among the leftist community, those who are anti-war, truly anti-imperialist, truly anti-empire. Those who are, now I'm not talking about Democrats or liberals, so to speak, although many leftists unfortunately have liberal tendencies. But I am talking about those who are opposed to what Israel is doing in Gaza, who are opposed to a broader regional war, who are opposed to the U.S. empire. There's a lot of pessimism. And I understand the pessimism to some degree because, well, when you have 20,000 plus Palestinians being killed, when you have massive escalations on all fronts, when you have, Ukrainians, Russians having to die in what seems to be really a war that is unwinnable, when you have a general sense of foreboding about the future, how these wars are taking away from the futures of an entire generation, multiple generations in the collective West, from those under 35, really 2 whole generations in that, in that sphere, just basically having lost everything because of these wars and because of the economic plunder and exploitation that is required and necessary to fuel them. When you have that scenario, and then you have really conditions broadly getting worse for the vast majority of people in the collective West, when you have so much suffering elsewhere because of these wars, it's understandable that there would be pessimism. It would be understandable if we have digested all of the images that Alexander Mercouris were talking about, videos, images of what's gone on in Gaza, of what Israel has done and continues to do. Then sure, that is inevitably something that will grind and grate upon our sense of hope and optimism. But I do want to say that there are many, many, many actually things to celebrate in this regard, and to remind that all positive developments that ever occur in the world order always come with immense sacrifice. This isn't a downplay death, destruction, murder, genocide, anything like that. But it is to say that everything positive comes with sacrifice. To believe that in the ways in which the world order is constructed and how the unipolar world has led it, to believe that anything good can come without some form of violence occurring, wars occurring, is to essentially be blind to, or maybe even just dissociate from, the reality of history, even in just the last 70 plus years. There has been, in the last 70 plus years, war after war after war, mainly led by the United States in an attempt to expand and then maintain its hegemony. To believe that anything positive to come out of this, any positive victory for people away from this, over this, would be without violence is maybe more than naive. it is to ignore history completely. So the fact of the matter is that despite all the death in Gaza, this moment in history has led to a proliferation in support for the Palestinian people that did not exist before. It has brought the question of Palestine and Palestinian people to the forefront, what their future should be, in a manner that hasn't occurred in decades, really. And to go even beyond that, we have seen demonstrations, even in just this region, that despite the unhinged character of Israel and the United States and how they behave, we've seen how the axis of resistance, Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others, how they have conducted themselves actually does lend confidence into the situation potentially coming to some kind of head. And as Alexander Mercouris said here on this program, the potential for some kind of resolution of some sort, whether that is a lasting peace or temporary peace or no peace at all, but just a gradual movement toward such a development. But I do believe that the axis of resistance is quite strong. There are reports that Hezbollah, in just the last couple months, in attempting to respond to this crisis in Gaza, has actually displaced hundreds of thousands of Israelis from the north along the border. And it hasn't even touched upon its own capabilities. And this is just one force in the region that does stand with Palestine, that does have quite a lot of influence in the capacity. It's always important to look at things soberly and to understand that the reason why there are hesitations with moving forward and resolving these issues by force amongst the axis of resistance is because there is no rationality among the neocons. There is nothing rational about the U.S. empire. There isn't going to be a pullback if Hezbollah or Iran or any other force in the axis of resistance decides to move forward in a more aggressive offensive posture. No, the exact opposite would occur. And regardless of whether we believe that's inevitable anyway, the point is that from the very beginning, Hezbollah, Iran, and others have said the point here is not to create a bigger bloodbath than what already has been spilt, but it is to strategically come to a resolution and a victory for the axis of resistance. And that takes discipline, time, it takes strategy, and it takes, and I don't know anything about this directly, but it does take a protracted struggle. All efforts, all resistance efforts from any force in history that has ever overcome empire has been a protracted effort. It has never been a sudden one. So with that said, just even in this part of the world, there is hope because that protracted struggle is in a more favorable position than it has ever been before in West Asia. Then we can move along with Russia and what Russia has done. As we've stated so many times on this program, Russia has defeated NATO, demilitarized NATO even, has proved that it is not invincible. Basically, Israel, NATO, the US, they've all been exposed as not only not being invincible, but actually being in a state of crisis. And so Russia has done that. And Russia will continue to do that moving into 2024. And the weakening of NATO, the weakening of the United States militarily is a good thing for the world. And that's the service that Russia has done for the world over this period, regardless of the externalities and, of course, the fact that nobody wants a war to be happening, but or at least nobody who stands on the side of peace and wants to see the well-being of people improved. But at the same time, when war comes at your doorstep, Russia and most countries, at least most countries with any kind of sovereignty, any kind of self-determination under their belt, would answer the door with a response and one that protects the house, right? One that protects the home. That's what Russia is doing. So that is positive because the developments that come out of that go far beyond Ukraine, as we've said on this program over and over again, from the guests that have come, like the Duran, like Sabra, like others, but also from myself, who truly believe that what's going on in Ukraine, the ramifications for the world have been very positive. We've seen much of the world, even those who have been generally on the side of the U.S. empire, generally on the side of the Western civilizational unipolar order, so-called civilizational order. Those that have been on that side, on the fence, or even just loyal compatriots of that, order are now moving away from it because the benefits have dried up, and now actually the potential dangers of it are not only just visible, because I think let's be clear that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would be naive to believe that being in partnership with the United States, as they have been for so long, would only and primarily be beneficial is ludicrous, to say the least. But at the end of the day, countries like the Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others now understand that not only is it more visible and exposed than ever that banking everything on the US's way of life and international and its so-called rules-based international order is a fatal mistake in many cases, but that there are powerful enough alternatives to give a more than an insurance policy, as the Western mainstream media call it, but really to give the possibility of an exit ramp from the worst excesses of this order, but also a potential permanent exit ramp when the time comes. I believe that's what BRICS expansion, the expansion of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the expansion of the Eurasian Economic Union, the Belt and Road Initiative, and all sorts of other multilateral mechanisms, whether they are led by a single country like Russia and China, or whether they are multilateral, truly multilateral in the sense that they do bring countries together in a manner that is truly multilateral. These institutions, they offer the potential for true exit ramp, and they're only going to get more powerful over the course of the next year in 2024. We're going to see BRICS expand even further. Vladimir in Russia assumes the helm as the next leader of BRICS when the summit happens in 2024. That there will be 30 countries plus that still have to negotiate whether they will join BRICS or not, and an invitation is likely to at least a portion of those countries to join the bloc. So that is hugely significant, and it wouldn't have come without the events that transpired in 2023. And we all have to take stock of that positivity and understand that, again, sacrifice is what brings positive developments in this world toward peace and justice. And Russia has given a real ultimate sacrifice, has put itself out there to stand up to NATO, to stand up to the United States empire in a way that has not really been done hitherto before this. If we think about even the Cold War, yeah, those countries, Russia, Soviet Union, China, they were standing up, but they were in revolutionary processes. They were in upheaval themselves. They were just trying to exist, and they did not want to respond to any provocations in the United States in a military manner at all. And it just happened that they did feel compelled to give aid, both for ideological reasons and also for military reasons around Korea and conflicts like that, Vietnam, because it really was an existential crisis to them should the U.S. Been victorious in those. So now it's different, though, because now, unlike the Cold War, you have these proxies leading to a potential direct confrontation. And the stakes, I believe, were even higher than in the Cold War when Russia decided to launch its special military operation. And this is because, unlike the Cold War, the United States truly was the unquestioned hegemon after the fall of the Soviet Union, and it only had several decades to get out of that. It wasn't in this period of decades and decades of trying to build up amidst massive attack. It was, though, responding to a Cold War 2.0 that we all need to, I think, take stock of and understand that it is a positive thing when Russia is able to undermine and defeat this process. And a defeat it has been with regard to Ukraine, a huge one for the US and NATO sphere. And then lastly, we can think about all the positive developments that have come from the multipolar world, from Russia's increasing involvement, leadership, etc. But we can't forget China and how China has very quietly, as of late, been charting an incredible way forward for countries in the global south, has been helping them diversify their economic landscape in a manner that is unprecedented, has been just blowing the minds of the collective West and the United States with its progress technologically, always trying, the US hegemon is, to demonize China and to make it look and appear as if it is about to economically collapse. But then you will find throughout the pages of Bloomberg, the Financial Times, etc., panic amid the massive progress that's been made around especially high technology and especially the semiconductor industry, as the US's sanctions fail in a major way, in a huge way, in China as well. And that is a hugely positive thing, because if you see how Chinese investment has helped Russia dramatically, has really been an anchor of stability for the African continent, for Latin America, and even much of Europe, what China has done is provide the biggest economic alternative that there is, while maintaining a pretty stable relationship with even its adversaries in a time where those adversaries, like the United States and the European Union, have done their best job at sinking relations. And so you really have China acting as this stable, massive ship of the world order, the multipolar world order, that has a real genius to it. Because if you think about how China has conducted itself even in the last 50 years since reform and opening up, 1979, the last 45 years or so, and if you see how this has transpired in the modern age in 2023, 2024, you see how the United States and Europe have struggled so mightily in negotiating this relationship, really truly wanting war, a la what's happened with Ukraine. That comparison is made all the time. Taiwan being the primary proxy, but really the whole Asia Pacific, akin to how Russia has been encircled by NATO. The United States has attempted to do the same thing in the Asia Pacific, but it's been a massive and pretty dramatic failure, because to decouple from China for the collective West as a whole would be economic suicide. And so China has this flexibility to both be embedded in the world economy and almost act as this natural defense from a major, massive global confrontation that the United States, of course, in many sections of its elite desperately wants with China. Most of the elite understand that to do so would sink the entire world order from which the United States has said it rules in any kind of manner, but especially, they claim a democratic manner. And then you have the fact that China, at the same time, is the key anchor, the key pillar of a multipolar world where alternative institutions like BRICS, like the Belt and Road Initiative that it leads, these are the future of the multipolar world, and these are the future, really, of the entire world, especially the global majority in global South countries. So all of these things are pretty positive, to say the least. I don't think we have to despair. We should not feel good when, let's say, Houthis are killed in the Red Sea because of what the United States does in response to its heroic stand there and blockade. And of course, in Gaza, the enormous tragedy that the Palestinian people are being imposed, is imposed upon the Palestinian people by Israel and its American backers. But at the same time, it's quite clear that the resistance there and much of the world understands that this sacrifice is indeed just that. It's a sacrifice. It's one that is about dignity. It's one that is about fighting for a real future. That's what the multipolar world is trying to do as a whole. And I think that there are going to be many bright spots in this amid the chaos that, of course, those of us watching and listening from the collective West are going to deal with. We will deal with chaos. We will deal with, I don't know if we can call them setbacks, but we will deal with damage. The United States and the collective West are going to do more damage to the planet. That is a given. But if we look at that as the primary jumping off point for how the world order and how the relations within it, social relations, political relations, military relations, among states, among people, how those are determined. If that's our primary determinant for those things, then yes, pessimism will reign. But if we look at how the axis of resistance, the multipolar world, Russia, China, etc., how these forces are moving in a completely different direction, one that is positive and beneficial to the whole of humanity, then we know that there's a balanced picture here that we really do need to promote. We really do need to popularize. And so I leave you with that message at the beginning of 2024. It will be a chaotic year. There will be quite a lot of suffering, but I do believe there will also be quite a lot of important victories, however small they may seem right now in the present. We are truly witnessing this progression moving toward a multipolar world at a pretty breakneck pace. But of course, patience is hard to have when you live within societies where your governments are responsible for all of the ills that afflict the planet. So, but it's important nonetheless to not just have patience with this process, but to uh, uh, study it, to be involved in it, to do our best to ensure that it is at the forefront of our minds when we are looking at global developments. Because if it isn't, then yes, we will get taken along the very miserable ride that US hegemony is trying to bring us upon, right? The roller coaster ride to hell, essentially, because that's where they're going. They're truly sinking the rulers of this system. They're trying to take all of us down with it. This is inherent to the process. This is inherent to its relations. It's why there's so much poverty. It's why there's so much racial tensions and racism. It's why there's so much suffering and exploitation. And it only intensifies the more desperate it becomes and the more desperate they become. But nonetheless, victory is closer now. This order is closer now to its demise than it ever has been. In 2024, we need to take stock of that, lest we move into our own kind of despair, which doesn't really help anybody. It really doesn't, right? It doesn't help us, and it certainly doesn't help those who are putting in immense sacrifice to change this world for the better. So I leave you with that message in 2024. I hope it is a great year for all of you. And I hope you all continue to return to this channel as we move along and as we continue to track these developments here. So, with all that said, everybody, that is it for me. Be sure before you go, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notifications bell. Make sure you go to the video description, find all the places of support from Patreon, Substack. You can become a YouTube member, hit that join button. There's Buy Me a Coffee, PayPal, one-time options. Of course, follow me on Telegram, follow me on Rumble, follow me on Rockfin, follow me on all platforms with my name. The Telegram link is in the video description. The Rumble link, of course, you can find me there as well in the video description. So go to the video description, have your way at it. I will be back next week, hopefully with one of the guests, if not both, Michael Hudson and George Galloway. I'll let you know the dates for those two shows. All the best, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye. See you again soon.